Hello and welcome back. This is the week 15 lecture. So this is our final lecture of the semester. So we're going to cover our final reading assignment, which is really just a single short story by Harriet Prescott Spofford. So we'll talk about circumstance today. I've included a couple of optional short stories also by Spofford. They come from the same short story collection as circumstance. So if you have the time and if you enjoy Spofford, you might want to check out In a Cellar or The Amber Gods, which is the title story of this short story collection that I'm using this week. But those are strictly optional. The only text by Spofford that is required will be circumstance. It's short. It's a nice way to wrap up. It's a good story. I think you guys will enjoy it. It's sort of a thriller, sort of a scary story, but also carries a lot of symbolic weight, which we can talk about today. But also, because it is our final lecture, I wanted to find some time to discuss our final paper and also the final exam, because I would imagine we might have a few questions about those, or we might just want to talk about them a little bit more. So I'll actually start there with the paper and the exam, and I'll just give you a few basic bits of info. And of course, if you have more questions, if you have any additional concerns, just email me and we can always talk more one-on-one. But you guys should notice that in the week 15 module, I've gone ahead and made everything available. So the final exam is there and the final paper. They're both due at the same time. They're both due on December the 13th. I don't really envision you guys turning them in at the exact same time, although you can if you want. I mean, obviously the idea here is that you'll do one and then the other. I don't mean for you to think that you're supposed to do all of it together or submit it all together. They really are two completely different assignments, but I'm just giving you as long as I can to get everything done. So the 13th, which is the Friday of exam week, that's pretty much as long as I can wait, for any work. So if you want to submit stuff a little bit earlier than that, feel free. If you're going out of town, if your, holiday is beginning a little bit earlier, you can always submit a few days prior to the 13th. But we have until midnight on the 13th to get everything finished. That's the idea. So you guys can really schedule these assignments however you want based on what works for you. I would suggest giving more time to the final paper. It's fine if you want to do the exam first, or maybe you want to do the paper first, whatever. But the paper is sort of meant to take more of your time. The exam is a single sitting. It's not going to take you 10 minutes, but it probably shouldn't take any more than an hour and a half. So the idea with the final exam is you sit down, you've done some studying, you've done some preparation, so you're ready. And you can just take the entire test in a single sitting. It really won't take you that long. Again, probably between an hour and an hour and a half to finish the exam. And that's done. The paper, I would like you to spend more time than that on the paper. I would like for you to sort of undergo all the different steps of the writing process, or at least as many as you have time for. And the paper is going to be pretty long. It includes research. So I envision that taking more of your time, devote more time, a little bit more energy to that, and then just find a single sitting or a single block of time that you can devote to the final exam. But you guys can figure out the scheduling and when exactly you do them, but you can start on them as early as this week. Whenever you're ready. Again, circumstance is the final required text of the semester. So if you have finished Blake by now, and I'm assuming some of us are probably still finishing it up here at the beginning of week 15, that's fine. Circumstance won't take you very long. As soon as you finish it, you're ready to start preparing for these final two assignments because we don't have any other assigned readings. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the exam first, how we generally take it, what to expect, the way I sort of put these together. And I have made available a study guide. That's also in the week 15 module. So take a look at that. I'm just sort of listing all of our required texts, and I'm giving you some basic info that you are responsible for when it comes to those texts. So obviously the titles of the texts, the author names, we need to get those right, and also the years of publication. So you guys have picked most of those up over the course of the semester, but it can be nice to have them all in one place. So that's what I've done with the study guide. All of our required text. I've also listed our optional texts because you can always write on those, both for the final paper and potentially on the final exam, but you won't necessarily be responsible for them. So what I mean by that is you can avoid writing about the optional texts if you want to. You'll never be required to write about them, but you can bring them in to some of your short answer responses or when you're writing your short essay for the final exam. You can also write your big final essay on an optional text. I really have no issue with that. I made those available in the hopes that you guys would read at least some of them. So if you want to do more with one of those optional texts, you always can, but you don't have to. That's important to remember. But you might want to just take a look at a few of those, particularly if you like an author, a particular author. Like I said this week with Spofford, if you enjoy Circumstance, you might like to read a couple of other stories by Spofford, and you might ultimately decide to write on her. So that's always a possibility if you have one assigned text and then a couple of optional texts from the same author. That can often be a good reason to do a little extra. But the only things you have to make sure you've read and understood will, of course, be the required texts. So I'm giving you some basic info, and I'm also telling you the major sections of the exam, and there's only 3. So the first part will be the identification section. If you guys have taken literature exams in the past, you've probably seen a pretty similar format. A lot of lit exams are very similar. You often start with an ID section, where I'll give you passages from some of our required texts, most of them, and you'll have to identify where that passage comes from. And you'll need to do that by using the title, the author, and the year of publication. So you can get all that from the study guide. You can use my study guide to help you prepare, but obviously you can't use the study guide when you're actually taking the exam. But in addition to providing those basic pieces of info for the ID section, you also need to write just a couple of sentences explaining the significance of the passage I've given you. So they'll always be important in some way. I'm not going to pick random throwaway lines that nobody remembers. Typically, I'll pick passages that either we've discussed in lecture or maybe stuff that we've talked about on the discussion board, or just really pivotal moments in the text, like really important turning points that anybody who's read the text would probably remember and be prepared to talk about. So again, these aren't going to be obscure, random passages. They're going to be passages that, if you read the text, you're likely to recognize. So just tell me where it comes from, title, author, date, and then briefly describe the significance. So that's the first section. The IDs don't usually take a super long time. You don't have to write a whole lot for each individual ID. It's just a little bit of a test of recall, memory, and also confirming that you not only remember who wrote this stuff and remember where these important passages come from, but also showing that you're prepared to talk about them and provide a little bit more explanation. So that's section 1. Section 2 will be the short answer section. So I'll just give you, a series of questions, maybe 8, and you'll have to answer 5, and you'll need to write more involved, slightly more detailed answers than what you were doing in the ID section. So, for the short answer, You might want to aim for like 3 to 5 sentences. You can think of them as like short little paragraphs. They'll often take that form. You need multiple sentences. You need to be able to do some elaboration, explanation, maybe pick out some specific examples. With short answer, I'm not expecting you to like quote stuff from memory or to do a lot of really super in-depth work, but I just want discussion. I want, developed thoughts, obviously complete sentences, and I want slightly more involved answers. And these will give you a chance to talk about specific texts that we've read, yes, but also some of the larger ideas that we've talked about throughout the semester. We've been kind of telling a narrative, right? Sort of telling this story of the development of a uniquely American literature. So we've discussed different kinds of genres, different kinds of historical movements, different things stylistically. We've talked about authors. We've obviously talked a lot about texts. So all of that really becomes fair game with both the short answer section and the short essay that you're writing for the final exam. Sometimes I want you to be able to tie your discussion of a text to some larger theme or idea that's been running through the class. And again, this stuff should be pretty clear to you, pretty familiar to you by now. You might want to review some of the weekly overviews. You might want to go back and rewatch some lectures. Those are good ways to prepare when you're getting ready for the final exam, and the final paper too, for that matter. But you might want to go back, especially if you skipped a week, if you skipped a lecture, or if you are just now catching up on some reading that we did several weeks ago. Maybe you haven't really gone through all the material that I've posted on that particular text. You have time to do that, either here in week 15 or during exam week, before our deadlines. So, short answer demands a little bit more, and I want to see that you have at least an awareness of some of our bigger concepts and ideas. And then finally, the short essay, not to be confused with our final paper. This is the exam essay. So it's shorter than what you'll be writing for the final paper, and typically I'll give you 2 prompts to choose from on the exam, maybe even 3, and you just pick one and respond to it, and that's the final part of the final exam. So obviously this is not open book. So when you're writing the short essay, I don't expect you to be quoting from memory. There might be a couple of quotes that you can remember if they're short and kind of famous, but I'm not expecting the same level of detail that I would expect on the final paper, something that you're spending a lot more time on. The final exam essay, it's just a final chance to show your mastery of the content that we've covered throughout the semester. So I'm not expecting a super high level of detail, but I do want to I want proof, evidence that you really have read and understood the text that you're talking about. And just like I was saying with the short answer, the essay prompt will give you a chance to speak about some of the larger themes, threads that we've been discussing throughout the semester, in addition to just talking about specific texts. So you can make some bigger moves and show me that you've been sort of following along with this narrative that we've been learning about all semester. So typically, I expect the essay part of the final exam to be maybe a page or two, in a Word doc, not nearly as long as what I would expect in that final paper. But I want it to be more than the short answer. I want several paragraphs. I want at least a brief argument that you can develop. In terms of structure and style, it's not that different from the response papers that we've done and this longer paper that we're about to do. The same basic tasks are before us. The same basic expectations of you showing me that you can interpret a text on your own, construct an argument that can really serve as your sort of original reading, and then provide some evidence. Again, if you're not quoting directly, you can at least point to specific scenes in the texts. You can usually do that from memory. You can usually do that if you've studied and if the text is still pretty fresh in your mind. So tell us specific things that happen. Use specific events or characters as your evidence to support your reading or your interpretation. So it's just a smaller version of what we've been doing, or what we were going to be doing for the final paper. And it's pretty similar, pretty comparable in terms of scope with what we've been doing with these short response papers up until now. So 2 pages, 2.5, getting maybe a little bit closer to the response the response paper length would be nice. If you can at least give me a full page, maybe a bit more, that's probably enough to get done what you need to get done in that short essay. But be specific, and again, try to do both the sort of close reading, textual analysis, and also be prepared to talk about some of our bigger ideas. So those are the 3 parts of the final exam. Use my study guide, go back, catch up on stuff. It's never a bad idea to reread stuff. You might not remember some of our earlier texts that well. Even if you don't have time to read all of Cabeza de Vaca again, you could probably reread some pages. You could go back to some important moments, refresh your memory. If you've been taking notes throughout the semester, and I hope you have while reading, annotating while reading, you might want to look over those notes, but also use my overviews because those really function as written notes covering what we're doing each week. So those are also worth revisiting. Like I was saying, everything in the modules really is worth revisiting when you are studying. So when you sit down to take the final exam, one more thing to remember, well, a couple of things. I don't mind if you have a note card. I know we can't commit everything to memory, so it's kind of old-fashioned, but since we're still doing this in a somewhat old-fashioned way, you can use a note card on which you have written notes. And those notes can be whatever you want. They can be author names, titles, years of publication. Those are often the things that are hardest to remember for some people. So if you want to write a bunch of those down, you can. If you want to write down some of our bigger themes, bigger concepts, because you're going to be talking about those at some point in a short answer or on the essay, you can do that. It's really whatever you want. I don't mind the note card, but I don't want anything beyond that. So you can't use the books themselves. You obviously can't use any online resources, just your note card. And the way we're supposed to do the final exam, we are supposed to have them proctored. But frankly, that's a lot of trouble, and I don't really want us to have to go through that. So the way I typically do it is kind of a compromise. Instead of being officially proctored, I would just like you guys to take your exam in a public place. Just because the temptation to look for stuff online is going to be diminished. So if you can do this at any GBC campus, at any of our computer labs or academic success centers, that's great. If you are in a GBC service area and you can go to campus on, in Elko or Winnemucca, Ely, Pahrump, that would really be my preference if you could do that and you can just take the exam, in the ASC where there is some degree of supervision and there's somebody you can check in with and you can give me all of that information. You can tell me where you're going and I'll be able to confirm. But if you're not close to a GBC service area, that's fine. A public library works really well. Any other educational facility, a high school, any other college, would work fine. If you're geographically closer to a different school, if you can arrange time to go there, if you can book space, or if there's free space available for you to use a computer, on campus, that would be fine. I don't care if it's GBC, it can be a different school. All I would ask is once you find this public place, if you could just email me the info for that place, the address. If there's a phone number or an email, I don't really need both, but one or the other, so I have some way of contacting a person there. And that's really it. Just tell me that's where you plan to go, if you could mention the day and time, but even that isn't as essential. I just want to know where you'll be, and I want some contact info in case I need to talk to those people. I usually don't. Usually this is all pretty painless and straightforward, but I just want to be as in compliance with the rules as possible. And if we're not actually going to get these tests proctored, we can at least, go halfway and do it in public places where we might, again, just be less inclined to look for any additional help on the internet. Again, the idea here is that these are places where there's somebody working the desk and there's somebody I can talk to in case there's a weird discrepancy or, something goes wrong with your submission or we have to figure out, some kind of plagiarism issue. That's not usually a problem on the final exam, but it's just nice to have contact info just in case. So that's my request. If you guys could humor me and accommodate me as far as that goes, that would be great. If you're going to have a tough time doing what I just described, just reach out, let's talk, email me. We can probably find a solution, but it will require some communication. Okay, so that's it for the final exam. Now let's talk briefly about the final paper. This is what I want you guys to spend most of your remaining time on. I recognize that you will need to study a bit for the exam, but I always tell people, keeping up with the class is really the best way to prepare for the exam. I myself am not a big believer in cramming. I don't think that's a great way to study or retain information, so I don't recommend it. As long as you've kept up with most of our readings, and you've been keeping up with the weekly stuff in the modules, you're probably pretty prepared for the final exam. So some study time, understandable, write up your note card, send me an email about where you're going, but again, I'm hoping the exam doesn't prove to be terribly time consuming because I would like us to put a lot of time and a lot of our effort into the final paper. We haven't done anything quite like the final paper so far this semester. We've done a lot of writing, but it's all been relatively short. Our short response papers, our discussion posts, we have a proposal and critical summary coming up soon. That's going to be short, but that's an important document to help you sort of plan your final paper. But the paper is a seminar paper, which means it's long, it's argumentative in nature, and it really is sort of the centerpiece of the class, I would argue, and the point value of the assignment would also argue that it's definitely the most important thing that we're doing assignment-wise throughout the semester. So give it the time and attention that it deserves. Don't rush it. Don't shortchange it. Start by reading my instructions. It's similar in a lot of ways to what we've been doing with our short response papers. I again want you guys to have an interpretation, an argument of your own that you can advance, but the scope is a lot bigger now. And the level of detail needs to be greater. The level of analysis needs to be a little bit more granular. We need more specific examples from the text. And of course, we need to do our research and be able to bring in some outside sources as well. Now, the final paper is very much the opposite of the final exam in that when you are writing the paper and when you are preparing to write the paper, you should have your chosen text in front of you at all times. It is very much an open book activity. You guys really need to engage closely with your chosen text. That is the name of the game with a paper like this. Can't be summary based. It can't be an overview. It can't be brief, general, or vague. I didn't want those attributes on the short response papers either, but those were so short, sometimes we could fall into a little bit of an overview mode, and that wasn't always the worst thing. But that's not going to work on a paper like this, a paper of this length, a research paper that is so important to our overall grade. So you have to generate a lot of original content. That's important. And that requires pre-writing. That requires planning, idea generation, and outlining. You guys probably know this because you've been in English classes before. I know you've written a lot of papers before, but for a paper like this, you really have to break it up into steps and into stages. You can't expect to sit down in a single day or a single night and write this paper, all in a single sitting without having done anything to prepare. You can try that, but this is not an English 101 paper. This is not 102. This is not 203 or 205, right? This is not the type of class where the length and the complexity level is low enough for you to be able to perhaps get away with that. For the kind of work that I'm looking for here in this final paper, you just need more. And you need to spend some time before you start writing, generating ideas and really going back through the text. So that's one of the big recommendations I like to make. Whatever you choose to write about, and it can be any of our required texts or any of our optional texts. And I'm assuming that if you're picking it, you've already read it. But go back and read it again, if possible. If it's an entire novel, maybe you don't have time to reread the whole thing. But go back to the chapters, the sections, the moments, the scenes that are most important to you. The ones that you remember the most, the ones that you took the most notes about, the ones that you think you're going to write about. And if nothing else, you should reread those. If you don't have time to read all of the incantatas or all of Blake, read the most important chapters or sections, because that's stuff that you're going to need to have fresh in your mind if you plan to write about it. So as we know, if you're going to write about Blake or about one of our other lengthy novel-length works, you can't cover everything. Your paper isn't going to be about everything that happens in the novel. Just like the response papers, you have to find an entry point. You have to find something specific to build your argument or your interpretation around. And I've seen a lot of these on the response papers. I've seen a few response papers that maybe don't do this, but a lot of us have found good threads, good individual elements or features that we can dig into. You're going to need more than one, but that's the same kind of work that we've been doing. Let's find an angle. Let's find a unique way to approach the text. So let me just give you an example to make this a little bit more concrete. So let's just say you've decided you want to write about Edgar Huntley. That's your favorite text of the semester. It was creepy, weird, and you think there's a lot you can say about it. Great. But like I was just saying, you can't cover everything in the novel. You have to pick your angle, your approach. What is your unique contribution going to be? Remember, for all of these texts, there's an ongoing discussion. There's an ongoing debate being carried on by scholars, professors, grad students, advanced undergrads, and this debate's been going on for a long time, right? However long these texts have been studied. So now you're joining the debate. Like it or not, when you choose a text and you start writing this assignment, you are joining that larger debate that's been going on maybe for decades, maybe for a half century. So if you're going to participate in that debate, you have to have an original contribution. You have to do something that advances the debate. It doesn't have to be a complete reinvention of the wheel, but it can't just be summary. You can't just tell us what happened, right? Everybody involved in the debate, we already know that. People who have read the book, they already know that. So if you pick Edgar Huntley, you can't just summarize the plot and tell us Edgar goes through a big transformation here. We know that. I told you that. Any summary of the book would tell you that. After you guys read the book, you fully understood that because it was obvious by the book's end. So that's not an argument. That's not an interpretation. That is a true statement that you can make, but you have to build something on top of it. So let's say you're sitting down, you're brainstorming, you're thinking about Huntley and how you want to write about it. So the best way to start really is with your emotional, personal response. What did you like best about the book? What did you find most interesting about the book? What scene, character, motif, moment struck you as most weird, cool, fun, exciting, scary, interesting, important, whatever? Just start with whatever you noticed, whatever you've written about or thought about or, were struck by. So that could be anything. But let's say for this example, it's that scene in the cave, where Huntley fights the panther and then eventually fights the Native Americans, and he's like becoming an action hero, before our eyes. A lot of you mentioned that scene, in your response papers. I talked about the scene in lecture. So we all know the scene. We all know what happens. So you can talk about the scene, but you have to go beyond just summary, just recapping the events. If you're interested in the panther, in particular, you might want to think more about what the panther represents, right? Think more about what nature represents. What does Norwalk represent in the novel? That might encompass some of the Native American characters. That might encompass physical aspects of the landscape, like the caves and the rivers. This sort of desolate, almost alien landscape. At least it seems that way initially to Edgar. So you got to do more than just tell us all the weird stuff that Edgar does. You have to dig into symbols, characterization, setting. I mean, these are specific literary elements that you can do a lot with. You can spend a lot of time in your paper talking about the setting, the real place, because it is a real place, not far from Philadelphia, but also the way it's described in the text. And a discussion of setting could also lead you into a greater consideration of the historical context that goes into the text. So that could be another thing you choose to talk about if you're interested in the Delaware tribe, if you're interested in the sort of crooked treaty that deprived them of their land in that area of Pennsylvania, which is all historical fact. You can read about it. Brown was drawing on that real regional history when he was writing the novel. So maybe your focus is going to be Old Deb, the native characters, the way they're described, and as we've seen, they're dehumanized, they're villainized, they're kind of a plot device, ultimately, in the novel, and they're sort of, responsible for some of Edgar's own misfortune, but it's sort of a weird, complex relationship, as we noted when we were talking about the novel. Edgar kind of has this relationship with Old Deb. Of course, it's been strained in more recent years, but they know each other. There's this proximity. So there's plenty you could do about that. Maybe your angle is history and the real relations between white settlers and Native Americans in that part of Pennsylvania. Get specific. You could use historical sources. That could work. Great. Maybe you're more about the panther. Maybe you're more about the sleepwalking, right? Find a thread. Find something specific in the text that you can pursue. It can't be the theme of the text, right? That's where we get too broad. Maybe that works on a response paper, though not great, but it's definitely not going to work on a paper like this because you can't spend, multiple pages just talking about the theme, right? The theme is where we end up, right? That's often where we finish. After we've explored a lot of specific elements, we end up with these larger meanings. And a lot of times the themes, they're kind of well known, they're obvious, and we can always find them online. So while it's fine to mention them and it's fine to kind of use them to help sum things up in a conclusion, once we've kind of arrived at our final destination, the theme doesn't necessarily need to be the focus of most of your interpretation or your argument. Again, you want to end up by showing us how your specific features, your specific elements express theme. So if you're interested in the Native American angle or the panther angle or the sleepwalking angle, ultimately you're using those individual threads and you're analyzing them in order to show how they contribute to the theme or how they work to make the theme legible. So you see, that's the kind of move you want to make, and that's how you develop more content. If you're just talking about the theme from your thesis statement all the way till the end of the paper, then your content becomes repetitive, it becomes redundant, and you just don't have enough content. So start by going back to your chosen text and reread as much of it as possible. If it is a short story or a poem, you can definitely reread the whole thing. Go back through it. If you haven't already taken a lot of notes on it, now would be the time to do that. Underline important passages. Identify key moments or lines of dialogue or descriptions that you think you're going to use later. Oh, I like this. I think I'm going to write about this later, so let me highlight it and make a note as to what page it's on. That kind of work will help you later. It might seem time consuming while you're doing it, but it will save you time when you're ready to sit down and actually write the paper. You want to have some content already in mind. So mark up the text, even if it's just a PDF and you're maybe annotating on your computer. If it's a book and you have the physical copy, you should be marking it up with a pen or a highlighter. Take some notes. Just start maybe free writing, whatever comes to mind. What are some ideas? What are some thoughts? That will also help you narrow down your approach. That will help you to figure out, okay, what exactly am I going to write about concerning this text? It could be a character. It could be a scene. It could be a recurring trope. It could be a motif, that runs through the text that we've talked about. Again, you'll probably find some information in lecture or in the overviews that can help maybe, help you find a direction, help guide you a little bit. But ultimately, you have to arrive at something that is somewhat original. It might sound a little bit like something that somebody else has said. I know it can be difficult to be 100% original, and accidents happen, and sometimes you might repeat, unbeknownst to you, you might repeat something that some other scholar or student has said, but there's a difference between repeating one thing and repeating everything, right? If you're doing the right kind of work, just by definition, your interpretation will be at least somewhat original. If you're not just ripping off somebody else or some other source, and you're really generating content from your own observations, your own ideas, and your own textual analysis, then it can't be anything but original, because every person is original and every person has their own thoughts and ideas. Some stuff will overlap, but most of it should not, if you're going about it the right way. But yeah, take some time to brainstorm, go through your text, take down some notes, and eventually you want to have an outline for the final paper. It can be rough, it can be very informal, but it's always good to have a plan. It's always good to plan the individual paragraphs that you're intending to write. That way, when you're sitting down to start writing, you are not starting from scratch. You have notes, you have stuff that you're intending to include, you're going to talk about stuff on page, 75 right here, the second paragraph. And if you've taken some time to do some research, you can also start thinking about how you're going to incorporate some of your sources. All right, so in this paragraph, I'm talking about this scene that happens on page 75, what this character says, and, oh yeah, I found a good source that also talks about it or makes a point about the text that I can use here. So that's what I'm going to do. That's your plan, and you can express that in your outline. And then once you have your plan, you're ready to sit down and actually start writing. And you don't have to be married to the outline. You can make some adjustments to that plan, but that's better than sitting down with a blank document with nothing in front of you and just saying, let's write a paper. When it is time to write, you should have your outline, in front of you or on the desk beside you, have your notes available, have your sources pulled up, and always have your chosen text by your side so you can refer back to it, quote from it, and just refresh your memory, because from time to time you'll need to do that. Okay, so the final thing I'll mention about the paper is the research element. So I know we've been using some outside sources for the short response papers, but now we're obviously doing more research. So I really recommend going onto the GBC library homepage and using the databases that we all have free access to as GBC students. Particularly, you want to use MLA International Bibliography. That's just a sort of one-stop shop for literature sources, scholarly sources about lit. You can really find a lot of what you need just in that one database. You can also use Google Scholar. You might be able to do some good focused Google searches, but remember, we want at least some of our sources to be academic sources, meaning they were published in academic journals, literature journals, written by scholars, professors, experts in the field. Not all of your sources have to be like that, but I would say at least a couple of them should. But some of you have asked, is it okay if I use a source that's not specifically about my text, or it's not even specifically about literature, but I think it could be helpful based on my topic, based on what I'm interested in. To go back to my early example, if you're going to do the Delaware angle, the Delaware Native American angle for Edgar Huntley, maybe you find some historical sources. They're not about Edgar Huntley. They're just about that real treaty that was signed by the Delawares like in the 1730s, right? That's fine. That's fine. You don't want all of your sources to be like that, but it's fine to have a source from history or maybe the social sciences or something else that's relevant to whatever it is you're talking about and arguing about. So that's okay. You can leave the world of literature for a source or two. And in some cases, you might have a source that's about the author that you're writing on, or it's about the larger text that you're writing on, but it's not specifically about your topic, your angle, your feature or element, or your collection of features and elements that you're pursuing. That's okay. There might still be an important observation or point in that article that you want to use because it can still work as part of your larger argument. So, use your good judgment. Not everything has to be specifically about your text and your topic, but some of your sources should be. And we want some academic sources, but we don't mind history. We want academic sources in terms of literature journals, but we don't mind history. We don't mind social science or psychology. That can sometimes work depending on our topic and our interest. So if you guys have any other questions when it comes to research, what you want to write about, how you're going to write enough, any other questions you have about the paper, let me know. I'm always happy to talk more. And I will give you some feedback on the proposals and critical summaries once I see those. So that's like kind of one assignment that includes two different tasks. It will be a brief proposal where you tell me what you're planning to do for your final paper. And then the critical summary is just your chance to show me some of the research that you've done up to that point. So I can sign off both on your idea for the paper and for the research that you're doing. So it's a little strange. The due date for this assignment is December the 4th, which is a Wednesday. So that's odd for us. Normally our assignments are all due on a Sunday, but I just wanted to kind of hurry up and get these in so I can provide some feedback, and then you guys can just focus on the final paper and the final exam. We don't really have any other scheduled things, and you can really make your own schedule from that point on. All right, so let me know if any of that remains unclear or if you want to talk more. And if you just want to bounce some ideas off, as far as your paper, I'm always happy to do that too. So let's talk a little bit about circumstance and Harriet Prescott Spofford, since this is our final text. I'll keep it brief because we've already had a pretty lengthy lecture, but I do want to wrap this up because it's a really nice way, this story is a nice way to conclude the semester. It includes a lot of things that we've been talking about, that we've been interested in throughout this class, so it's a nice way to conclude, and I think we'll notice that Spofford has a lot in common with a lot of these other writers that we've seen recently, Melville, Poe, Hawthorne to an extent. she shares some interests and some stylistic tendencies with a lot of those figures from the American Renaissance. So this is part of the larger story that we can tell about Spofford. For a long time, she was forgotten. She was an important writer back in the 19th century, but like some of the other authors we've looked at this semester, she fell into obscurity not too long after her death. She had a long writing career. She wrote a lot of different stuff, novels, poetry, short stories. We're seeing examples, obviously, of her short stories this week. She was also the writer of children's lit. She did other kinds of writing, and her career lasted, I believe, all the way until the 1880s. So she kind of got discovered, really, by the wider reading public in the late 1850s. And she went on to write for much of the remaining part of that century. So a long career, prolific, worked in a lot of different genres, and was popular for much of her life, but then fell out of favor, sort of fell into obscurity after she died, and she wasn't read for a long time. She was not entered into the American literary canon, along with many of her contemporaries like Melville, Poe, and Hawthorne. But she was kind of rediscovered later, like in the 1980s. So the book that I'm using, what I took the short stories from, is a collection called The Amber Gods that came out in the 1860s. But it was sort of brought back to the popular consciousness in the 1980s, largely through this edition, which was edited by this guy Alfred Ben Dixon, who's a pretty important scholar of American lit. He's still alive. He used to teach at Princeton. I think he's somewhere else now, but I mean, he might be retired by now. He's pretty old, but he's an important guy in the study of American lit for the last couple of decades, a very renowned scholar. But he was a real champion, and still is, of Spofford and her work. So not only did he, kind of bring this collection back into circulation, he also wrote the critical introduction, which is really good if you're interested in Spofford. I'm going to read a few sections from it, a few excerpts from it today. But Ben Dixon, part of the case that he makes for why she's important and, why she needs to be included in our list of best authors, best titles, best achievements in American lit, is because she has so much in common with those more famous American Renaissance figures. So he describes her as having very inventive subject matter, richly descriptive language, a unique style of phrasing, and also an interest in unusual occurrences. So in those ways, she can often be compared to these other Renaissance figures. She's interested in a lot of the same stuff they're interested in, and her style, her writing style, is also comparable to theirs in certain ways, particularly Melville. Melville should still be somewhat fresh in our minds, so I want us to notice maybe any similarities that jump out as we're reading Spofford, if we can think back to Melville, but also Hawthorne or even Poe. A sort of love of unique phrasing, rich wordplay and language, but also an interest in sort of some darker threads of psychology, aberrant behavior at times, and what we might call opacity. If things are opaque, they're not immediately clear or like transparent. They can be a little bit difficult to understand. And that's the way we often talk about Melville and Poe and Hawthorne. There's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of ambiguity wrapped up in their stories. And that exists on multiple levels, not just in terms of what the stories are about, like they're often kind of mysterious in terms of their plot, but also in terms of how the language works, how the symbols work, how theme and larger meaning works. Like we talked about this with Melville and with Hawthorne particularly, like there's a lack of illumination at times. There are shadows, there's grayness. It can be hard to understand at times, and that both refers to their language and sort of their concepts, their ideas, the conceptual level and the stylistic level. And we kind of see that with Spofford as well. So So Ben Dixon kind of helps to bring her back by comparing her to these earlier sort of Renaissance figures that had been read and celebrated for a long time. So I've talked about the American Renaissance a lot, but we've also used this word romance a lot. We've been talking about the romance as it existed as sort of a pre-novelistic form of prose fiction, like often supernatural stories, kind of, beyond the pale of typical everyday reality, sort of improbable events, often exotic settings. These were characteristics of older romances that, like we've seen, really existed before the modern English language novel. And then once novels got big, really starting in the 1700s, we had to develop a distinction between realistic novels that were often sort of ripped from the headlines, similar to newspapers in some ways, often telling stories that really did happen, just with slightly different details, changing the characters' names, versus what were considered still kind of works of romance. Novels that were more improbable in terms of their plot events, often a flavor of the supernatural. Things that weren't strictly realistic, but were considered more imaginative, more symbolic, more figurative. So I mentioned that Hawthorne kind of helps to define this in the introduction to one of his novels, where he talks about how romances are different from what he calls novels. But for us, that would just be the difference between sort of improbable, like the word is eluding me right now, like the extraordinary sort of subject matter. We talked about it with Cabeza de Vaca too, like stuff that is just, strange, not strictly realistic. Again, that could sometimes be supernatural, or it could just be highly improbable, sort of just extraordinary events. But often sort of improbable plot developments, heightened emotions. These were all characteristics of romance, but they filtered their way into a lot of novels to the point where that distinction between romance and realistic novels kind of goes away, and they just become different kinds of novels. But that distinction mattered for much of the 19th century. So when Spofford's early work was described, the short stories that she was writing in, late 1850s into the 1860s, those were often considered works of romance because they were improbable in terms of plot. They often had very heightened emotions, exotic settings, like In a Cellar, her first real hit story, for example, takes place in Paris. So not everyday sort of American settings, but more exotic, imaginative types of things. Again, sort of extraordinary, not super ordinary. So that's what a lot of her early stories sort of felt like. And they often were sometimes thought of as a little bit sentimental too. So remember, sentimental fiction was often pretty realistic in terms of plot and characterization, but we had heightened emotions. We had this emphasis on right feeling, on having the right kinds of feelings of empathy, sympathy, helping people, perhaps wanting social reform, feeling for other people who were going through hard times. So sometimes some of that stuff also got wrapped up in some of our romantic elements. We had heightened emotions, maybe some moral instruction. That wasn't a requirement for all of it. But again, a lot of this would have been the way Spofford's early work was described. A little bit of romance, maybe a little bit sentimental, and that would have been considered pretty typical of what a lot of women writers were doing during that time. But then her later work was quite a bit different, and it kind of gets assigned a different genre. It's often thought of as what we now call local color or regional writing, which really became quite important later in the 19th century. We're not exactly covering that development in this class because it happens after the Civil War. It happens later in the 19th century, and we're not moving that far. But she's often associated with that movement a little bit as well, but that's her later work. That was often a lot more realistic and a lot more steeped in specific New England settings, unique to that particular region. So that's often how local color or regionalism, as it came to be known later in the 19th century, that's often how those genres were described. They're very interested in local ways of life, local characteristics that are very specific to a particular region and capturing that region in a fairly realistic way. So maybe a little bit like what we saw with Sleepy Hollow, but that story still had some elements of romance. It had maybe the hint of the supernatural, some improbable events, heightened emotions. It's maybe a very early example, though, of that interest in regional traits that would later become very, very important and very common in American lit. So Spofford wrote for so long, she really sort of migrated into a whole nother genre. She started out with these sort of works of romance, maybe a little bit sentimental, and then later she was doing this kind of more regional specific work that's also considered important today from a historical standpoint. So she's lumped in when she's described later as sort of a writer of New England local color. She can sometimes be compared to other writers who also did that kind of work, like Mary Wilkins Freeman, Sarah Orne Jewett, who wrote the Country of Pointed Firs, which is kind of a famous work of New England local color, really regional specific and hyper-realistic, really. So I would say most of the stories in this collection, The Amber Gods, would sort of fall under that romance heading. Again, very inventive subject matter, rich descriptive language, a bit ambiguous at times, highly symbolic, highly figurative, and pretty similar to a lot of these other works of the American Renaissance that we can also consider to sort of be works of American romance. That's often a term that gets used on Melville and Hawthorne and Whitman and some of these other figures that we've read recently. So let me share with you a brief passage from Ben Dixon's intro to The Amber Gods, where he's kind of making this larger point a little bit better than I can. Like Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville, Spofford expects readers to accept extravagant plots and exotic settings, extraordinary characters, and unusual situations, a prose style that rejects the plain simplicity of ordinary speech in favor of an elaborately wrought literary language, and a process of symbolism in which the natural merges with the supernatural. So again, these are all things we've seen before, and we're seeing them again with Spofford. The American tradition of romantic fiction is also characterized by a deep fascination with aberrational psychology that often reveals an underlying skepticism about both human nature and human society. That's definitely true of Melville, Poe, and Hawthorne, and he's saying it's true here too. Emerson may have preached the gospel of self-reliance, but our best fiction writers have been more concerned with the corrosive effects of egoism, morbid obsession, sometimes leading to monomania, masochism, and the urge to self-destruction. Harriet Prescott Spofford merits attention as the major female practitioner of a mode of symbolic romance which many have asserted to be the mainstream of American fiction. Her major achievements stem from an ability to work in genres generally assumed to be traditionally male. Her most interesting works transform these genres substantially. So I want to go back to what he says just a few lines above when he calls Spofford the major female practitioner of a mode of symbolic romance, which many have asserted to be the mainstream of American fiction. So he's sort of alluding to that process that we talked about earlier in the semester when a bunch of American lit scholars roughly 100 years ago sat down and figured out how to define American lit. What were the most important texts? Who were the most important authors? And he's saying they kind of determined that this brand of highly sort of opaque, symbolic romance, as practiced by Hawthorne, Melville, and Poe, that's kind of the best achievement of American literature. That was kind of the decision they reached. We might not necessarily agree, but at least if we're thinking about the 19th century, that is still thought of as sort of the biggest achievement or the most lasting achievement of American fiction from that time. Again, some people would argue and say, well, sentimental novels were actually doing a lot more practical work and they were a lot more successful. But if we sort of accept the idea that these Renaissance figures, these figures from the American romance that we've already read, if they do sort of form what is now seen as the mainstream of 19th century American lit, well, Ben Dixon is making the case that Spofford is very much their peer and very similar to them in a lot of important ways. But he goes on to make some interesting points about other things that she's doing. So he calls In a Cellar, which is one of our optional texts for this week, he considers that to be one of the best early examples of detective fiction in American fiction. So Poe was doing it. Spofford kind of does it too in a similar way. Like Poe, she goes to an exotic setting. She has highly symbolic language. She's not always as interested in the case as much as she is the characters and the methods they use. That's true of Poe's detective fiction as well. But she's not ripping Poe off, right? This is also an original vision, but Ben Dixon is just making the point that, Poe always gets a lot of credit for being one of our first detective fiction writers, but Spofford was doing it too around roughly, the same time. So just wanted to share that, and if I can find it, there's a great quote in here from Emily Dickinson, who we are not reading, but you will read her in the next part of 451. When you take Tim, Dr. Esch's class, you'll cover Dickinson among many others, of course. But you guys know Emily Dickinson probably. She's a famous author from the 19th century. She has been canonized. She is thought of and has long been thought of as a really important American poet. But she was contemporaries of Spofford. I don't believe they knew each other, but their writing careers did kind of overlap. And we know that Dickinson read Spofford because she had a couple of mentions of Spofford in her letters. So Ben Dixon tracks a couple of these down. So in one letter that Dickinson wrote to her sister-in-law, she praises Circumstance in particular as, quote, the only thing that I ever saw in my life that I did not think I could have written myself. So that's pretty high praise. That's also kind of a sign of her own massive ego. But the fact that, she thought Circumstance was the only story she had ever read that she didn't think she could have written herself. And in that same letter, Dickinson also asks her sister-in-law to send along everything else that Spofford had written. She wanted to read it all. But then later, in a different letter to a different person, Dickinson pays a very different kind of tribute to the terrifying nature of Circumstance when she says, I read Miss Prescott's Circumstance, but it followed me into the dark, so I avoided her. So I'm not quite sure what the end of that means, if she means that the story was so frightening that she resolved not to read any more of Spofford, or if she just means that she couldn't return to Circumstance because it followed her in the dark. Of course, speaking figuratively, but kind of a good indication that this story does linger a bit. If you do find it scary, it does have a tendency to kind of linger in the memory, and it has some ramifications, some potential consequences that are not totally explained in the story. So that's left to us to kind of figure out. So let's move through the story briefly. I'll try to keep it brief since we've already gone so long, but I just want to make it clear that there are kind of two levels here, right? If we're thinking about this short story, there is the surface level, and it's a pretty straightforward horror story if you're just looking at the surface level. There is a bit of a twist ending, but it's pretty easy to follow. It's a pretty straightforward plot. Our title character, who remains nameless, our protagonist, is walking home from a neighbor's house at the beginning of the story. And I just wanted to point you to some interesting word choice. If you look on the very first page, 84, where the story begins. Again, a couple of words that should remind us of the sentimental literature that we've read when we see in that opening sentence that our protagonist had been busy all day with care and sympathy, because that was a woman's lot back then, right? She was expected to go and care for sick neighbors. That's not something that her husband would have ever done, but that's what she's doing. She spent all day at a neighbor's house caring for her neighbor, practicing sympathy, exercising these right feelings, these right kind of moral feelings. So a little shorthand right away as to the kind of life that this character leads, her personality. She's kind of a conventional homemaker, but she lives in a frontier district. So Spofford herself is from Maine, so we can assume that the setting here is probably roughly, close to Spofford's own home, or where she grew up. So this is kind of an older frontier district of Maine that has not fully been settled yet. So it's perceived by these white characters as the wilderness, almost empty of anything other than danger. So we see very quickly that there's a lot of potential danger that one can encounter in the wilderness, right? And the danger that she specifically encounters is that she is captured by a panther. So I'm not sure if that word is ever actually used, but that's what the animal is. It is a very big cat that kind of picks her up and takes her up into a tree. So she is seized and borne aloft, meant she is taken up into a tree by this huge panther. And while she's in the grasp of this big cat, she realizes that she can calm it down by singing. And that's what she's able to do to stay alive until her husband eventually shows up at the end of the story. And that's where at first, we seem to get a pretty conventional ending. And we'll talk about the ending at the end of this discussion. But it really is kind of a twist, because what seems like her salvation, what seems like rescue, might actually be the opposite for our protagonist. But we can imagine that, for this time period, walking through the woods would have been pretty scary. There were a lot of things that could happen to you out there. You could get lost, you could fall and get hurt. And she's in a very remote district, right? It's made very clear that neighbors back then in this particular part of Maine were located very far apart. Miles and miles away from each other. So it's not just a simple walk around the block. For her to walk back home so she can cook dinner and sort of get ready, to spend the evening with her family, that's no small undertaking, right? So she has to walk a long way. She's all by herself. She has no weapons, right? And she's walking through the woods. So back then, for people in an area like that, there really would have been two big concerns or two major fears that would have animated a lot of their daily life. The fear of wild animals like bears and panthers, but also, of course, the fear of Native Americans. And that's another fear that sort of shows up in this text, somewhat similar to the way it shows up maybe in a text like Edgar Huntley. Native Americans are not centered here. They're not even characters, we couldn't say, but they play a role in the plot. They're at least a plot device that we can consider. So clearly Spofford's not interested really in humanizing them or making them complex characters, but insofar as her protagonist is complex, we can understand that she's conquering a lot of fear, a lot of danger, but we also learn early on that she's pretty tough, right? This character has lived out here for a while, so she's pretty tough and she's pretty accustomed to all the weird and scary stuff that somebody might encounter in a frontier area. So even before she has her encounter with the panther, she sees this strange, vision. Maybe it's an apparition. It's not really clear. This strange winding sheet that appears before her. This is on page 85 of the text, if you want to look. It's described as cold, white, and ghastly. It is held up by hands. We're not sure who's doing the holding, but it's held up by hands, and then she hears voices saying, "The Lord have mercy on the people." Not fully explained. It seems like a vision, maybe a premonition, maybe it's connected to what happens at the end of the story or what she discovers at the end of the story. It's a bit ambiguous. It's a bit opaque. But what I'm struck by always is that it doesn't really faze her. She just keeps walking. She has the strange vision. She's definitely aware of it, and she's kind of maybe thinking about it a little bit, but she just keeps on. Stuff like that, weird stuff in the woods happens all the time. So it's going to take more than a strange apparition to stop her or to really make her afraid. So she's tough, she's pretty hardy, and pretty self-possessed. So that's all, but eventually she's in real danger once the panther gets a hold of her. So that's all pretty clear. That's all pretty easy to follow as far as the surface level plot and what just happens in the plot. But if we move to a deeper, more symbolic level, many critics, including Ben Dixon, see this as a story about a woman who's being captured by certain social and familial expectations and duties. And we've already kind of explored this theme with the coquette, and we've talked about it at other times as well. Women were very much confined during these earlier periods of American history. They had very little freedom, really, very little agency to kind of choose their own path in life. And as we saw with Eliza, that's really especially true of middle-class women. If you're middle class, you shouldn't work, but you don't have enough money to live independently. So you're really caught between these expectations. You shouldn't work to support yourself, that's beneath you, but you don't have enough money to support yourself without a husband. So you're kind of forced into this domestic arrangement where you're financially dependent on your husband, and hopefully you just are kind of hoping the husband's a good guy, gives you a good sort of family life, you have the kids, you cook, you clean, you mostly are confined to the domestic sphere. And if you don't really dig that, like Eliza didn't, you're kind of cast off, you're kind of ostracized. So we've already seen that, we know kind of how that works. So we can understand that this character and circumstance is kind of trapped by those same forces, those same sort of societal roles and expectations. But over the course of this terrifying night that she spends in the tree with the panther, she discovers that she does have power. That she actually is very capable and very independent when she has to be. So she realizes that she can actually escape, that she possesses the means to escape from her confined state until her husband shows up. And he kind of ruins the whole thing. So I'm going to run down the interpretation that Ben Dixon shares, because I think it's pretty sharp, and I think we can use it. We don't have to agree with all of it, but it's pretty compelling. So he argues that this entire narrative is really the story of the protagonist's journey of self-discovery. And her discovery is really represented by the different songs that she sings in the tree. So she starts out on page 86 singing what's described as a cradle song. The same type of cradle song that she used when she rocked her own baby to sleep. So this is important. This is very much based in her family life, this first song. right? It's very much about her role as wife and mother. It's very much about her own child, her own experiences in the home. So this is very much a traditionally feminine song. It's the type of song that would have been expected to be sung by a woman, by a mother in particular. It's like a lullaby. It's a song designed for small children. And since women were primarily responsible for small children, this song is sort of coded as feminine. That's what Ben Dixon argues. And it's a natural place for this character to start because we've already seen that she occupies a pretty traditional feminine role in this older American society. So this is the kind of song that she would be expected to know and she would be expected to sing. So that's the first thing she goes to. But as a result of that cradle song, she starts thinking about home. She starts thinking about her husband, her child. She starts to miss them. She starts to worry that she might never see them again. And as a result, she unintentionally stops thinking. She stops singing because she's distracted. She's thinking about these other things. So Ben Dixon argues that this is a kind of a subtle way for Spofford to indicate that too much focus on family life completely effaces the individual. And it might even be dangerous for the individual. If you can only think about your role as wife and mother, you might not be able to protect yourself in a situation like this. Because when she gets too wrapped up in thinking about home, she stops singing. And when she stops singing, the panther starts to gnaw at her again. The panther can only be pacified if she's singing. The panther enjoys her voice, but when she stops singing, the panther seems on the verge of eating her. And that's, of course, what we are worried about. She's assuming that eventually the panther will eat her, but she's trying to hold off as long as possible. So once the panther starts to gnaw on her arm again, she then shifts gears into a different type of song. So I wanted to read a little bit of this directly from the text on page 87, just the way these new songs are described. So if you look on 87, this is like the first full paragraph on page 87. Is it? Sorry, I thought I had the passage, but now I'm struggling to find it. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So this is actually a little further along the passage that I was going to read. But okay, I'm getting out of order here, so I'll share the passage in a moment. But next, she moves on to what are called more, kind of prototypically masculine songs, starting around page 87. She starts to perform sea shanties, reels, jigs. These are often thought of as songs that are coded as more masculine. They're not all explicitly masculine, and obviously a woman can sing them too, but they're often thought of as kind of more active, more festive, and that's what she goes to after the cradle song. But then she increasingly gets a little bit more desperate, a little bit more mournful, and then she ends up with what are called more melancholy, forsaken songs, weeping, wailing tunes. So that's actually the passage that I wanted to share on page 90, on the very top of page 90. Feeling her desolation, wild, melancholy, forsaken songs rose thereon from that frightful eyrie, weeping, wailing tunes that sob among the people from age to age and overflow with otherwise unexpressed sadness. All rude, mournful ballads, old tearful strains that Shakespeare heard the vagrants sing, and that rise and fall like the wind and tide. Sailor songs, to be heard only in lone mid-watches beneath the moon and stars. ghastly rhyming romances. And then she provides an example from an old poem. So notice how much the song choice has changed. She goes from that classically feminine cradle song to songs that would often be associated with men. Songs that would have been, sung by sailors, or the kinds of old vagrants, usually male, that maybe show up in a Shakespeare play. So Spofford's tapping into a lot of older sort of traditions and sort of imagery here. Tapping into, again, more masculine music, stuff that's more active, maybe thought of as more vigorous, but also just more steeped in history, a longer lineage, a longer textual lineage, stuff that has a history, has sort of a mournful, melancholy history that can be traced back to older texts, older authors, largely male. So what Ben Dixon is saying is she's making this transition into more masculine music, and she's staying alive, right? She's adopting stuff that wouldn't maybe have normally been available to her in everyday life, right? Even like with some of these jigs, right? I think at one point it's even described that some of that stuff maybe would have been played by her husband at home, right? So the sort of more fun dancing music that you might have had at a party or a wedding or some other kind of celebration. How many a time she had heard her husband play it on the homely fiddle made by himself from birch and cherry wood. And she can remember seeing people dance to songs like these. But again, it's important to note that her husband would often play those songs. So maybe she had some role, maybe she could dance, maybe she could sing too, but this is music made, at least in part, normally by men. Men would at least be involved. Men would be playing many of the instruments. Men would have been dancing. So it's a very different kind of music than what she started out with. And Ben Dixon argues that her use of this more masculine music shows that she's discovering her own power. She's discovering her ability to do things that she normally wouldn't have done. Okay, so maybe we see that. And then eventually she moves into another kind of music, a very different kind of music. Grand and sweet Methodist hymns. And these kind of transport her into a very different state of mind. Some sort of revelry or like a religious vision takes place on page 93. It's described in the text as a divine rapture. So this is a very sort of exalted spiritual frame of mind that she has entered by this point. And she seems to gain strength and a certain kind of resolve from this vision. Maybe she's kind of accepted her fate. She's finding a higher power. She's almost transcending her material circumstance. It's almost like she's no longer in the grasp of the panther. She's been elevated to a higher plane where she's almost maybe in communion with God or with some kind of larger spiritual truth. That's what's happening. That's where she is when her husband shows up to save her. And once he shows up, notice two important things happen. Two very significant things. First, she loses her vision of God's peace. It goes away. And then she loses her voice. Now we can observe that as both literal and also a figurative occurrence. She literally loses her voice because she's been singing all night and her throat's really sore. And I know that experience. If you talk too much, if you lecture too long, you will eventually lose your voice. So there's a practical reason for that, and we understand it. But there's also the symbolic meaning. When her husband's there with a gun and he ultimately shoots and kills the panther, by doing that, he is robbing her of her symbolic voice. He's robbing her of the power, the strength, that she's discovered overnight in the tree all by herself with this big predator. And she stayed alive using her resourcefulness and not just using the feminine coded stuff that she's always had access to, but also using those masculine songs that she wouldn't necessarily have had access to. So, really, according to Ben Dixon, her husband showing up has a surprisingly negative impact on her. She loses her voice. She loses the power that she gained overnight with the panther. So, once her child and her husband appear, she's kind of back to that conventional domestic feminine role. And she loses the transcendence. She loses the power that she previously gained. So Ben Dixon sees a lot of significance to the phrase, she had learned the secret of sound at last. That's directly from the text. She had learned the secret of sound at last. So he claims what that quote really means is that the whole plot here, the whole story, is about learning and about transcendence. And even though she's caught in this terrifying situation, she's able to tap into a power greater than herself. That's what the song does for her, right? It allows her to go beyond herself, to transcend herself, something greater than herself and maybe even greater than her family. And see, that's kind of a revolutionary notion for a woman during this time period, to think that there could be more than domesticity. There could be more than her husband and child. There's more out there, and she's seeing it, she's feeling it, up until her family arrives. She learns how to stay alive. She learns how to support herself. She learns how to get closer to God. If we read that sort of moment of like spiritual transcendence that way, she might almost reach God. She does all this alone. And she does this while singing songs that would have typically been sung and played by men. But again, she loses all of that once her husband shows up and kills the panther. And then they go back home only to discover that their home and their entire village has been destroyed by a Native American war party. So in some ways, being captured by the panther and then making her husband, I mean, she didn't mean to, but having the husband and child leave the home to come and search for her has saved all of their lives. That's the twist. That's what we maybe don't see coming at the very end. But I would argue, and Ben Dixon certainly argues, that the husband's role is also kind of a twist. We expect him to play that heroic part, but maybe in reality, he's doing the opposite. And even though the protagonist is back to her typical role as wife and mother, she's changed now. She's probably never going to be quite the same as she was before the night with the panther. She's different. And that takes us to the very end, where we have this very ambiguous conclusion. And Ben Dixon has done quite a bit of work to show how Spofford is actually quoting Milton from Paradise Lost at the very end. So if you go to the very end, and I am sorry if I've spoiled it for you, but at the very end, they've seen the desolation, their entire little community has been destroyed, and then we get that final sentence, separate from the previous paragraph. For the rest, the world was all before them. Where to choose? And if you think that's kind of a strange line, a little bit enigmatic, well, it's not Spofford's invention. It's actually a direct quote. I don't think you guys will be able to see the footnote in the PDF that I posted, so I thought I would just read you this excerpt from Paradise Lost where she's getting that line. So, as we see in the footnote provided in my edition, Spofford's final line alludes to the departure of Adam and Eve from Eden at the end of Milton's Paradise Lost. I know many of us probably haven't read that epic poem, but you're probably at least somewhat familiar with it. It's all about Satan and Adam and Eve. So let's just read this little part from the much longer poem. They, being Adam and Eve, looking back All the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate, with dreadful faces thronged in fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. So this is literally the moment when Adam and Eve leave Eden, and they're basically just trying to figure out where they're going to go next. What is next for them? Where will their journey take them? And yeah, we can see a pretty direct comparison, like that is the same situation that our protagonist and her husband are in. Where are you going to go? Your house has been burned down. You got to go somewhere else and start over. But we should think more about Eden. And this sort of larger symbolic importance of the scene and that quote. What does it mean? Are we supposed to see this couple as Adam and Eve? And if so, what does that mean? What is the significance of that? And what is Spofford telling us with that conclusion? So, like I said, much like Melville or Hawthorne, the meaning is often wrapped up in several layers of ambiguity with Spofford. There's lots of symbolism, there's a bigger meaning, there's a surface level meaning, sometimes they're in sort of opposition, there's a lot of digging and interpretation to do. But they're also just fun stories to read, highly skilled construction. Again, notice her language, notice her style, and notice some of those heavily symbolic meanings, and you might be able to make some connections with those earlier Renaissance figures. Again, they're all kind of part of what's now often referred to as American romance. All right, so I think that's enough for our final lecture. If you have questions about anything, let me know. We'll talk more either through email or I can set up a video conference. And on the subject of video conferences, I would like to have them with all of you next week, or I should say this week, week 15, our final week of class. If that's possible, I would love to do it. If it's not possible for all of us, we might be able to just email. But I have a schedule, a sign-up sheet for this week that I've posted in the week 15 module. If you have the time to meet with me, I would very much like to do that so we can discuss Essay 4. So we can talk about ideas, maybe look at your outline, and get you ready to start writing. Or maybe even look at a draft. You can always send me a draft through email, but it's often helpful to look through one together in a video conference. So I would like to do that throughout the week. There's only about a dozen of you, so we should be able to schedule a conference for everyone. Just let me know if you can do it, or if you just really can't do it, let's at least try to set up a time to have an email exchange. All right, so I look forward to talking to more of you about your essay ideas. I hope you've enjoyed this semester, or at least parts of it, and please get in touch if you need anything. Good luck.